familiar with TLTS, it stands for translanguaging and transsemiotizing. It's a student host, a postdoc and student host seminar series. And so welcome to join in. And before I introduce our very important speaker today, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel, and also press the button, the bell, and then you will get reminders of we will have a seminar every month. So please join in and give us a like. And I want to announce the next seminar first, which is May 26th. May 20 is usually a Friday in North American time and a Saturday in Asian Pacific Australian time. And yeah, you can see this is our next seminar in April 16, okay? And we also have a stellar team of speakers. So do remember to join us in April. Now, back to today, I'm so excited and so happy because I have Dr. Kok-Sing Tang with us today. And Kok-Sing is a very good friend because we share a common friend, and you can guess, it's Jay Lemke. Okay. So I got introduced to Kok-Sing's work and Kok-Sing by Jay Lemke because Jay said, you have to look at Kok-Sing's work. So, so now we have invited Kok-Sing to speak in our seminar series. I'm so excited, so happy, so honored, so privileged, okay? Now, Kok-Sing got his master's in physics from University of Cambridge, and then his PhD in science education from University of Michigan, where her supervisor was Jay Lemke, and then later on also Elizabeth Mote. And he has this rare combination. He is just like Jay. He is an expert in science education. No one knows more. I mean, science education in our team. Okay? But he's also an expert in discourse strategies and languages and literacies in teaching, in education. And you rarely find this combination in a researcher, in an educator, in a scholar. So when we find him, it's like a precious, like a diamond. Okay. So without further ado, we will hand over to the speaking floor to Kok-Sing to do a short 30-minute presentation, and then it will be over to the forum. It will be hosted by our postdoc and students in both Asia, in both Asia Pacific and North America. Over to you, Kok-Sing.
All right, thank you, Angel. Thank you so much for the overwhelming introductions. And thank you for inviting me to take part in this seminar. I'm really excited really to be here, not just for you, but also for everyone here, and also for people who are watching this channel. I have sort of participated in some of the seminars, and I must say I'm really impressed by how organized and how efficient it is run, and also the exciting seminars regularly over a period. So I want to thank all this wonderful students and postdoc for making all this happen. It is really sort of a great service, I think, to the education research community, especially within this COVID period where we don't get to see each other, but through your seminar we get to interact. And I really like that you invite scholars from all over the world. So I'm really sort of privileged and excited to be part of this seminar series and to allow me to share my work with all of you over here. So now I will share my screen to talk about my work. Okay. All right, so the topic of my talk today is on discourse strategies for science teaching and learning. And this is the same title as my recently launched book over here that was published a few months ago by Rowledge. So Angel has took this as an opportunity for me to invite me to talk about this book, which I'm of course very excited about. So let me just start with a bit of background about the book. So this book is an accumulation of actually more than 10 years of my research since I started my PhD in Michigan with Jane Lemke and Elizabeth Moshe, and then moving on to Singapore, and now working in Australia. So I've always been working in this research space that combines both science education and literacy education. And over the course of these 10 years, I was involved in multiple research projects that have collected a lot of video data from the science classrooms, mostly in the grade 5 to grade 10 science classrooms. So I spent a lot of my time analyzing these videos using the methodology of discourse analysis. The book also incorporates a number of theories that I've learned over the years, including social cultural theories, systemic functional linguistics, and social semiotics. Some of these theories have been quite challenging for me, especially someone with a science background. But I must say that they were really crucial because I would not have been able to do the work in this book without using those theories. And another thing that went into the book is several practical ideas that I use in my teaching of the pre-service and in-service science teachers. And this is really crucial to build that research and practice connection, which is one of the main goals of this book. So it's always good to have students with you to be your guinea pigs when you want to try some new strategies. So you can get their feedback to know whether the strategies thinking about whether they'll be useful or not. I'd like to start by defining what are discourse and discourse strategies. So I define discourse as a social pattern in the use of language that shapes and is shaped by the way we think, act, and make meanings. There are three terms in this definition I want to further elaborate. First, as we all know, language is not just about speaking and writing, but language is a multimodal system of making meanings. Second, language is always in use. So the term use of language involves the dynamic and dialogic nature of using language as a social action to do things. As for social patterns, what I meant by this is that discourse is the combination of language and social cultural practices that are manifested as recognizable patterns within a community. So these patterns can be observed from the way we speak, the way we write, draw, or perform something. And if you can recognize these social patterns, then you should be able to participate in the community. So this idea of a pattern is very important in the book because it helps us to analyze discourse based on the patterns that we can observe. As for discourse strategies, I use the definition from verbs as the methods of using discourse to achieve certain goals in the interaction. So discourse strategies can be something as simple as opening and closing a dialogue to something that's more complex, like arguing, interviewing, or questioning. And we use discourse strategies all the time when we engage in a conversation, whether or not we are aware of it. For teachers, I would say that discourse strategy is the most fundamental resource that they have in the classroom. Here are some of the key assumptions and arguments of my book. So when discourse strategies are unconsciously used, I call them implicit. So this is a social pattern in the conversation that is based on the speaker's neutral roles and expectations, their power relations, and their views towards a shared knowledge. So this slide, you can see that there are two different interaction patterns of almost the same content. And on the left side of this transcript, you can see this famous initiate, response, evaluate pattern, or the RRE pattern that many people know about. So in this pattern, teacher initiates a question, a simple question, and then a student responds to that question, and then the teacher evaluates the answer. IRE, and this IRE pattern repeats several times until the teacher has exhausted all the questions they want to ask. So IRE pattern is driven by the teacher's questioning technique, which is really a kind of discourse strategy. Now, the problem here is that many teachers are not conscious about this discourse strategy of the way they ask questions. And this is one of the reasons why they often ask a lot of questions that result in a simple IRE patterns. And we have known that the IRE pattern is not so good in promoting student thinking and deep learning. However, if you understand this discourse pattern, you can make a very small change in one of the moves and create different patterns shown on the right side of the slide. This will lead to an IRF-RF interaction pattern that has been documented by Mortimer and Scott. Now, I want you to compare two transcripts over here. You can see that the first two moves, the initiate and the respond moves, are exactly the same, right? So they asked the same question and the student gave the same response. In the third move, you can see that teacher, instead of evaluating whether the answer is right or wrong, the teacher did a follow-up move with that response. But in this case, the teacher asked the students, how do you know that? So this question probed the students' reasoning and the source of evidence. And then further down, you can see two more follow-up moves. And we actually have names for this follow-up move. The first one is called an extend. And the second one is called a refractive toss. So such follow-up moves are able to generate a more logic exchange, a chain of communication compared to the IRE patterns that is more straight, simple. So these examples show us that there is an interconnected relationship between the interaction discourse pattern and the discourse strategy of questioning. So understanding the discourse pattern is linked to the development of a discourse strategy and vice versa. All right, what are some of the discourse strategies that we can use to change the interaction pattern? So these are some of the strategies and techniques that I talked about in the book chapter. I won't go into all the details, but what I want to highlight is that most of these strategies were actually developed by experienced teachers, and then they were observed by the researchers that were cited on this slide. So for these teachers, these strategies are most likely implicit to them because they're not even aware of it. But when the researchers study these teachers, they document these strategies, and most importantly, they gave them names for these strategies, names like extend and probe, revoicing, refractive toss, and constructive challenge. So this is how these strategies became explicit. And now that they are explicit, we can now teach these strategies to the less experienced teachers. So when I was teaching the pre-service physics teachers in Singapore, one of the things that I taught them was this thing about interaction patterns and the discourse strategies. And in one of the assignments, I got this student teachers to role play as the teacher, having an IRF-RF discussion with their own peers. And in this assignment, in the role play, they have to apply this follow-up moves in their discussions, and they need to record these conversations that they have with their peers. And after that, they need to transcribe the video at their own talk, and they have to analyze their dialogic and follow-up moves. So after the training, many of these teachers came to me and told me that this is really one of the most useful things that they have learned in their teacher training. So this is really one of the inspirations that got me to write this book on discourse strategies for science teachers. Right, moving on to the thematic patterns. This is really important for science teachers because this is looking at the content of what is being taught. And this chapter, chapter 4, is really inspired by Lemke's book, Talking Science. which was published more than 30 years ago, but it is still so relevant today. So in Lemke's book, he introduced this concept of thematic pattern, which is defined as the pattern of semantic relationships among the words that are used to describe a thematic content. So again, let's look at this transcript, which is actually the same transcript I used earlier to show the IRE interaction pattern. Now we're not looking at the interaction, now we're looking at the content through the pattern. So if you look at this 6 lines in the transcript, over here, the thematic pattern was developed by the teacher, the 2 students, through their question and answer. As you can see from this thematic patterns, a number of semantic relationships join these keywords. So all the lines are the semantic relationships. For example, over here you have this semantic relationship or hyponym, which is a type of relationship. So for example, solid and liquid are types of matter. And then over here you have another one where water is a type of liquid. Now, interestingly, this semantic relationship of hyponym was actually never mentioned in the transcript. If you look at the transcript, you don't see that they were actually talking about this type of relationship. So this implies that, the semantic relationship was not actually mentioned, but the students have to know it in order to follow the content. So thematic pattern can be very useful to show us what are the semantic relationships that were explicitly mentioned in the conversation, as well as what are the relationships that are actually missing from the conversation. And when they're missing, there's an assumption that this should be known by the students. If not, then they can't follow the conversation. All right, so let's talk about the discourse strategies that come out from the understanding of thematic pattern. In Lemke's book, he highlights a number of strategies. For example, equivalent and contrast, repetition with variation, and structural strategies with like analogy. I can maybe assume that most of you here have read Lemke's book and have knew about these strategies. So Lemke acknowledges that although these strategies are quite common, they are not really effective in terms of highlighting the semantic relationships that students need to know. So there's really a need for more work in this area. And on the bottom of the slides, I show some of the examples of strategies that are more explicit in nature in terms of naming or emphasizing the semantic relationships, especially relationships like hyponym or murmonym that tend to be invisible in the dialogue. And now we have this idea about unpacking and repacking meanings through the idea of semantic wave, which is currently a big topic in LCT or legitimation code theory. Angel, in her and Ling, have also pioneered this strategy that they call the C+L mapping, which combines concept mapping with thematic pattern. And lastly, there's this strategy that I use called jumbo sequencing, which gets students to rearrange clauses and sentences in the correct order, and then writing down the conjunctions that join those statements. So these are some examples of more explicit discourse strategies that can help students to follow the thematic pattern. Third pattern in the book is what I call a narrative discourse pattern. This is a pattern of how the scientific story is narrated from 2 perspectives. The first perspective is about how classroom events across time are linked and joined together. And this is achieved through the use of organizational metadiscourse. The second aspect is how the author's affective and ideological stance towards the scientific story is subtly conveyed through the use of evaluative metadiscourse. Now, these 2 narrative aspects of the scientific stories, they are seldom explicitly communicated directly, but they are always indirectly conveyed through the use of metadiscourse. And now this is a good place for me to say more about what is a metadiscourse. So a metadiscourse is talk about our own talk. That's a simple definition. It's a kind of commentary that we made about our own text in the course of speaking and writing. Most people use metadiscourse in their everyday speech, even though they even realize that they are using metadiscourse. So the key function of metadiscourse is to help audience to connect to the message in a way that the author wants them to connect and interpret it. So this is the reason why metadiscourse is closely related to a narration. So when you want to tell a story, you don't just give the facts or the events of the story, but you will want to tell the story in a way that is engaging and organized. So this is why we use metadiscourse. And according to Shiflin, there are two major types of metadiscourse: evaluative and organizational metadiscourse. So evaluative metadiscourse, its job is to accentuate the aspects of the message by injecting the author's attitudes and stance, while organizational metadiscourse assists in building the rhetorical structure of a message through things like signposting, signaling a topic shift, or highlighting sequences. For people who, I think most of you here are familiar with SFL, so there's actually some agreement that these two types of metadiscourse are closely aligned with the interpersonal and the textual metafunction in SFL. So evaluative metadiscourse is quite similar with Martin's appraisal system, and the evaluative metadiscourse is quite similar to Halliday's and Hassan's cohesion. But I wouldn't say that they are exactly the same because they have different historical origins, but there's definitely a lot of overlaps and convergence in this area. All right, let me show you an example of narrative patterns and a metadiscourse. So in this transcript, we have a teacher who was about to explain pressure of a guest using this idea called the kinetic model of matter. What is interesting in this 6 lines of text is that the teacher was not doing the explanation yet. Instead, he was actually setting up the context for a later conversation will take place later. And in that later conversation, he and the students will be talking about or building their explanation. So what the teacher was actually doing here is that he was framing narrative of how that later explanation should be interpreted and how it should be developed according to certain standards. So let's see how this narrative is being framed by the teacher. So over here, I've marked out a number of organizational metadiscourse in blue and the evaluative metadiscourse in red. So for example, when the teacher kept signaling to the activity that they are doing together, like when he said, how do we explain together? Let's try to phrase it together. So here he's trying to make a connection to the ongoing activities that they were doing together. Here he's also trying to connect to an external activity of doing an examination through this phrase here when he said, let's say this is a 4 marks exam questions. So these are all examples of metadiscourse. And at the bottom, you can see another metadiscourse, and this is an evaluative metadiscourse. In the last line, the teacher says, so let's see what are the important keywords you need to make use of. So this is a kind of evaluative metadiscourse called attitude marker, because it signals how the students should feel about the content matter. And the attitude here is, at least from the teacher's point of view, is about the attitude is about importance. So it is important to the teacher that the students must phrase this explanation according to several compulsory keywords. So this stance conveys a very authoritative and exam-oriented narration of the scientific story. I have other examples to show how different narrations it signals through the use of different kinds of metadiscourse, but in the interest of time, I will not show it here. I want to talk about a study that I did a few years ago, where I analyzed the metadiscourse used by science teachers in the classrooms. Study, I developed a typology that named all the metadiscourse I observed, and there are in total 19 of them as shown on the slides. And I also organized them into these 6 different categories. 3 of them are organizational metadiscourse, and 3 of them are evaluative metadiscourse. Now, however, these metadiscourse are actually implicit strategies. Firstly, I should say that all metadiscourse are discourse strategies, because if you follow the definition that I gave earlier about the discourse strategies, metadiscourse is a kind of discursive strategy. It's a kind of discursive methods that we use to achieve certain goals in a conversation. So by that definition, all metadiscourse is actually a discourse strategy. However, they are very implicit because the teachers are not even aware that they are using metadiscourse and that they can use metadiscourse to enhance their teaching. Here, I'd like to make an argument that a judicious use of metadiscourse can contribute to good teaching. But I want to stress on the word judicious use, because if you use too much unnecessary metadiscourse, it can actually be quite distracting. Right? So just like questioning, questioning is normally good for teaching, but if you ask too many questions in a very short time, in a very IRE manner, that actually may not be very good. So it's the same for metadiscourse as well. So in order to use metadiscourse judiciously, you need to be firstly aware that you are using metadiscourse, and then secondly, to know how and when to use metadiscourse appropriately. So this is where I think we still need a lot of research on how to make metadiscourse more explicit so that the teachers can use them more effectively. And this research area is still quite new. All right, the last pattern I will talk about is genre patterns. And according to Fakoff, a genre is a set of conventions associated with and partly realize the way people carry out their practices with language in the community. Martin also defines genre as a stage and goal-oriented social practice in all human activities. And for those of you who are familiar with the concept of realization in SFL, a genre is a pattern of register, but a register itself is also a pattern of lexical grammar. Sorry, a register is a pattern of discourse semantics, and discourse semantic itself is a pattern of lexical grammar. So there's this pattern of kind of relationship in SFL. So genre is really one of the highest level of a discourse pattern. In science, Halliday and Martins, in their book Writing Science, they documented that there are 4 major genres, and they are experimental report, information report, explanations, and argument. These genres are also closely related to the idea of scientific practices, which is now a big topic in science education. So there's a lot of synergy and convergence in between genre and scientific practice. In my book, I focus more on the genres of explanations and argument, because these are the 2 main genres that most science teachers and students need more support. Let's look at an example of an explanation genre as manifested in classroom discourse. So this is the transcript. It says quite similar to the one that you saw earlier about the exam questions. So here the teachers and the students are constructing an explanation. And the thing is, they are constructing the explanation without knowing and identifying the stages of an explanation. So they're just giving the content of the explanation, basically. But in the previous studies, I developed this framework to identify the structure of an explanation. And this framework is called PRO or PRO. So the P here stands for premise, which is a statement held to be true that does not need to be explained in the context of the explanation. So a premise provides a first cause of an explanation. The R stands for reasoning, which is a chain of sequences, such as cause and effect, and temporal sequences that deductively links the premise to the outcome. And the thing that links the sequences together are the use of conjunctions. And then finally, outcome, O, is the phenomenon to be explained. Now, using this framework, I identified the different components of an explanation. For example, in the transcript. So these are the different components using the PRO framework. I quote on different statements from the transcript. So you can see that the genre pattern is actually there. They are very implicit because the teacher and students never actually talk about the structure of the explanation. And also they don't talk about what is required for them to construct the explanation. They only talk about the content of the explanation. Now, over here, I want you to compare this transcript that was facilitated the same teacher, and the content is also mostly the same. This transcript was actually taken 1 year later, and we have actually done some research and intervention with this teacher. I give you 1 or 2 minutes to look at this transcript and see whether you notice anything different from the previous transcript. transcript, you can see that students actually use, it's the one who initiate the use of pro. And then with that use of pro, they're now talking about not only the content in terms of the kinetic model of the air particles, but talking about the structure, what is the P, what is the O, and so on. So you can see that this is the teachers are using the pro language, and now they're applying it to facilitate their own talk. And as I said, when they use it, they don't just talk about the content, but they are talking about the explanation more metacognitively, like what is the structure, and over here, talk about what is the difficult part of this explanation. So the difficult part is not about the kinetic model, but the difficult part is about the chain of reasoning that they need to make in the explanation, because the chain of reasoning has a lot of cause and effect, and a lot of the use of conjunctions to formulate this reasoning. So this transcript shows a good example of how we can use meta language as a form of explicit discourse strategy. So now it's a good place for me to talk about what is a meta language. And here it's good to clarify the difference between meta language and meta discourse, because some people tend to confuse between the two. So a meta language is quite different from meta discourse. Firstly, meta discourse, we use it all the time. Whether or not we know it. So everybody use meta discourse in their own everyday speech. As for meta language, we don't actually use it so often because meta language is much more specialized. Now, the New London Group defines meta language as the language for talking about language, images, text, and all meaning-making interactions. Rob Ellis, who is a very famous linguist working at Curtin University, he defines meta language as the technical terminology to describe language. Many researchers have now argued that meta-language is very useful as an explicit instruction to talk about the language conventions in the discipline. Okay, we need to clarify that there are many different kinds of meta-language, so this can be quite confusing. In SFL, if you're familiar with SFL, all the technical terms like transitivity, taxonomic relationships, cohesion, appraisal, these are all meta-language because they describe the functions of language. In science education, people have also begun to realize that there is also a meta-language for talking about scientific language specifically. So they use meta-language like with terms like law, theory, claim, model, hypothesis, premise, and outcome, and things like that. So the pro framework that I developed draws from both of these traditions, from SFL as well as from science education. So pro is an discourse strategies that was developed for the teachers and students to learn, and when they learn it, they subsequently applied it to talk about the genre of a scientific explanation. One last pattern from the book, and this is the multimodal pattern, but I think this will be another presentation of its own because there's a lot of things to talk about here, so I think I will most likely skip it. What I want to say about multimodal pattern is that whatever things that I just said earlier in terms of the interaction pattern, the thematic pattern, the meta discourse, or the meta language, they all apply also in the multimodal domain. So when speech is combined with drawing, gesturing, and so on, all of these ideas are the same. And maybe we have another presentation to talk about it in future. I want to round it up now, so that's my last slides. So I think I've covered a lot of discourse strategies. And I want to come back to my main argument concerning what is implicit versus explicit discourse strategies. I think you should see by now that this implicit-explicit distinction is not a fixed binary. Rather, what is implicit or explicit really depends on the user and also on the context. However, this implicit-explicit distinction, to me, I think it is a very useful heuristic for us to work with teachers. And so I have this diagram that I hope that can summarize this cycle of making implicit strategies explicit and then making it back implicit again through this cycle that go through many different areas. So if you think about research, the purpose of our research is really to document, to name, and to codify all the implicit discourse strategies that we can see in the classroom. And this documentation will include both the experienced teachers who should have have some good strategies to show us, as well as the inexperienced teachers who may not be using very good strategies. But once all these strategies are made explicit, then now we can talk about it, we can discuss, critique, and refine the strategies. And for the strategies that are good, we can also highlight and teach them to the less experienced teachers during the teacher training or during professional development. Then as the teachers apply those strategies, as they learn the strategies, they can now reflect and apply those explicit discourse strategies into their own classroom. And with more practice of using these strategies will over time, hopefully, become implicit to them because it becomes second nature to their own teaching practice. So this is the cycle of how the implicit become explicit, and then back to implicit again. Yeah. So this is a cycle of research and practice connections that we hope to achieve in this research area. So I think with that, I think I can stop here now and maybe open our time for discussions. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I can't wait to read the whole of your book because it's so relevant to many of our teachers and researchers here. So I'd like to invite our hosts, postdoc hosts and student hosts, both in North America and in Asia Pacific. So over to you, Bungi. You have a question about critical science. Could you elaborate your question?
Yeah. Thank you, Kok-Sing Tang, Dr. Kok-Sing Tang, for very solid examples and presentation. It really gave us a good picture of what it is and science discourse per se. And more and more as I'm working with Angel, I am start to wondering more about how does critical science, critical CLIO or critical science classroom might look like. Can you, if you don't mind, could you give us an example? Because I start to realize that science education is not just about learning about scientific information, but we are using science to understand socially and scientifically controversial issues. For example, wearing masks, getting injection, flu shots, or those are based on science information. And I wonder how teachers can incorporate those controversial issues into their science classroom.
Right? Climate change.
Yeah, exactly, climate change. Could you like a picture of a classroom where the teacher can incorporate various discourse strategies with the critical science literacies? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that question. It is an excellent question, and it's very important in our times now, especially in this post-truth era where there's a lot of fake news and conspiracy theories, and even people believing that the Earth is flat. And COVID is just a fluke and all these things. So what you're talking about is what we call scientific literacy, which is really a goal in science education. So what I talk about mainly is really the means, the how to. But yeah, I didn't talk about why are we doing all these things, for what is the purpose. And you are exactly right that the purpose is to develop scientific literacy. And I need to share this from a science educator point of view. Science education is not about producing the next generation of science teachers or scientists or engineers. Because if you think about it, within a population, only about 20 or 30% of our children will end up becoming scientists or engineers. Then what happened to the rest of the 70%? Then why do we teach science, right? So really the key goal of science education is this idea of scientific literacy, to make sure our next generation is able to critique what they read in the news, in the area of science and technology. So whatever they read, they need to not just only understand it, but they need to evaluate whether is it true. And nowadays, the people who, and this is such an important area when people are now questioning even basic facts and having all these alternative theories and so on. And actually, interestingly, when I was writing this book, and I was writing the last chapter, I was, my last few pages, it happened during the time when COVID happened and all of us were locked down. And in the COVID, you hear a lot of this fake news, especially Donald Trump talking about drinking bleach to cure a coronavirus. So I was really reflecting on this idea of scientific literacy, and I did make a note, not very long, but a few pages to talk about the goal of discourse strategies. It's not really just to understand the science content, but to develop this scientific literacy to be able to evaluate text. And I think that's where discourse strategies are very useful. And here, perhaps I want to share the framework that I use to understand critical literacy. I use the multi-literacy framework from the New London Group. I think most of you are familiar with that. So in the New London Group, they highlight 4 stages of multiple literacy, if you remember. The first one is immersive practice or immersive situation, which is really about immersing students to authentic learning experiences. And we do that a lot in science, through hands-on activities, through inquiry-based learning and so on. So that's taken care of. Now, second part, they call it overt instruction. And this is very close to explicit literacy that I'm talking about. And this is something that maybe science education people don't do as much. And this is where I think we need a lot of people like you from language and literacy to highlight what is overt instructions. And we need to be very careful that overt instruction is not about telling, it's not about lecturing. And I think this is a very common misconception that's why people are avoiding overt instructions. But overt instruction is about highlighting the language conventions. So when students write lab report, what is the conventions required? When they write an explanation, what is the conventions required? Because if you don't know the conventions, you can't participate, you can't write an explanation or a lab report. So that's why you need to make that convention explicit for them. But they didn't stop there, and this is the part where it answers your question. The next part is critical framing, which is about critical literacy. And then after that, they talk about transform practice, which is to invent new ways or new conventions. So, but the interesting part is that to do critical literacy, you need to have the second step first, the overt instructions. Because if you don't even know the conventions of scientific explanation, for example, how can you even critique the explanations? Then I didn't talk about argument, but I mentioned that argument is a very important genre of scientific practice because argument is about using claim and using evidence to support your claim. And this is an area that science education is paying a lot of attention. That argument, when you make a claim, you need to have evidence to sustain your claim. And argumentation is about two-person dialoguing, having opposing views to talk with one another. So overt instruction is important because you need to unpack what is an argument, how does an argument works, what is the claim, what is an evidence. If you understand the structure, then you can use that not only to make your own argument, but you can also critique someone's argument. See that does he have an evidence? Is the evidence sound, and so on. So this is very important. If you look at this flat Earth theory, which I'm now very interested, people are believing that the Earth is flat, and they come up with all kinds of reasons to justify why they think the Earth is flat. So this is an area where we need to teach scientific argument to the students to when they read those theories, right? They need to unpack what is the evidence used, are the evidence sound, and things like that. So I think that there is a lot of need for us to practice scientific argument, scientific explanation, and that's where explicit instructions comes in very powerfully to convey those ideas. I've written a few articles. If you're interested, I can send to you, and that talks about this whole notion of argumentation and scientific literacy and how discourse strategies play a part through all these things.
Yeah, we are actually trying out your PR on premise, reasoning, and outcome. This genre pattern, argumentative pattern, explanation pattern. Yeah. Okay. Thanks so much, Qinghua. Over to you. You have a question about energy.
Actually, yes. Energy is actually the example of the question that I want to ask. So I am a language teacher. I do language training to students online. So one of the time when I was teaching TOEFL listening, I find it's quite interesting. There's a confrontation. When I go to a training session offered by ETS, they will say, "Oh, we don't test any content knowledge. Students are not expected to have any content knowledge. We only test on language, so don't worry about it. You just teach your listening." But when I go to the class and teach the student, I find out that without content knowledge, it is very difficult for students to actually learn the language of science in the class. Like the example you highlight in your example, you highlighted the kinetic energy produces heat or sound due to friction. So words like produce and due to, it's going to be very difficult for a language teacher to be able to explain what it means to a student without letting them know the logic behind the heat and friction. So when I try to do that, I find it quite useful if I am able to harness the students' existing knowledge in science. If they had learned the same thing maybe in Chinese in their physics class in Chinese before, then it becomes much easier for me to actually explain the term and for them to be able to get the idea from the listening. So I kind of also feel that the discourse science discourse strategies that you mentioned is not only about teaching like science content knowledge, and I find it may have a great potential to students in a situation that they have already equipped with the content knowledge of science in these subjects. They just want to get the way to express that in another language, which is mainly in English. So I would like to say, if you have any comments on this, whether do you see that it can be something that we can do? I think it's connected to like Clio and also translanguaging, because the students learn this information, the content knowledge in Chinese actually, but now they're making it in English. So I would like to see if you have any comments on this idea or this practice. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for that question. Yes, I think you make the right point that so this is where thematic patterns come in very useful, because as you say, if you pick out the thematic patterns, thematic patterns, what is good about it is emphasize the semantic relationships rather than the grammar or the word actually used. So there are many different ways to say due to, right? There are many different ways to say that this is a part of, or this is a type of, like when you say, for example, it's the same as saying it's a type of. So there are many different ways of making the same semantic relationships. So your suggestions that the idea is that the student's first language it can be used as a resource to help them bridge the gap. So for example, if you have two conversations, one in English and one in, say, Mandarin, and then you construct the thematic patterns, by right, the thematic patterns will be the same, right? Because the mapping will be exactly the same. So I think thematic pattern will show you that by mapping out the semantic relationships, you can see what is similar, what is different. So it's a very visual way of highlighting those connections. And this is where the students, if they know the content in their first language, they can actually harness that to form the same semantic relationship in the foreign language. And then now when they learn the word to substitute the semantic relationship, it will be much easier. So the word will now have that meaning that you already know, rather than learning a new word that has a new meaning that you didn't know. So I think that highlights the potential of using two different languages to help you make that kind of semantic connections. The other thing you can also highlight is the use of non-verbal language. So this is a thing I didn't talk about in that multimodal patterns. So there's also a multimodal thematic patterns, which is so you don't just look at the words. But the diagram also forms similar. It's not the same, but similar semantic relationships. So example will be liquid. Water is a type of liquid. Visually, how do I show that? Most people will draw a Venn diagram, right, and showing a circle within a larger circle. So that shows you that there is a semantic relationship, and that can also substitute the lack of that language ability to describe that relationship. So Gumperz, of course, have done a lot of work that translate those semantic relationships, and if you know it, you can actually use that to support your clear teaching. And I think quite a number of researchers have started to do that. One of my PhD students here, Melody Williams, she's actually working in Hong Kong right now. So she's actually applying this idea of thematic patterns in her CLIO classes. So some of her publications talk about using visual and gestures as alternative pathway for them to bridge those semantic connections. Yeah. So
it's a wonderful contribution of Lemke is this semantic pattern, which is kind of like getting to the content, and then Chinese, English, Japanese, these are, the wordings, right? The wordings are the superficial features, but the semantic relationships, like X is an example of Y, or Y can be classified into A, B, C, D, E. This kind of is cognitive discourse, semantic relations also. I know Amy raised your hand, so I let you jump ahead. Otherwise, I will ask Michael to ask the question. So Amy, just make your question brief because you will have your turn to ask questions.
Sorry, I would like to chip in because I think the question is quite relevant to the issue I have in mind, because now Dr. Tang talks about semantic pattern and also its relations to first language or second language and also multimodalities. So that's sort of what I have been encountering in my own research too. So I actually realized that it's not only semantic pattern is so powerful that it kind of gives us a framework that will be much more encompassing than the traditionally lexical, grammatical, like word level or sentence level based that kind of approach. Because at the level of semantics, then we are able to kind of look across different synergies between different so-called linguistic systems and also non-linguistic systems. But then my question would then be like, what do you envision ways forward in like, because in your book you also the most close will be like the multimodal integration patterns, like looking at actually for example first language, students' first language or different kinds of semiotic resources can be one semiotic, right? So would you see that would be a way forward in, because it's not only like translation between different languages. Sometimes the patterns may not be mapped exactly one to another.
Yeah.
Like because the teachers can be using analogy or kind of different kind of things, but then if you do a semantic pattern analysis, you will realize seemingly they are talking about different things, but actually the underlying patterns sometimes will be much more implicit. But you could kind of how navigate or do drawing on students' existing knowledge, right? So that's the general question that I'm having, and also would like to ask your insights, like ways forward, and also an aspect relating to working with teachers, right? Particularly like science teachers, how do they react to this kind of semantic approach? Would this sound familiar to them, or need more work in bridging them between them? Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah. So you're asking about the way forward. Are you asking about the way forward in research or in teaching?
Both. So then both ways.
Okay.
Because like it seems to me that semantic pattern may not be very accessible at the first look to teachers. Would that, from your experience, like?
Yes. Yeah. I think maybe I answer.
Yeah.
I answer the second question first. That's easier. The way forward of using thematic patterns for teachers is not easy, especially for science teachers. I tried it before. It's not very successful, I would say, because they really need to understand some linguistics, and once you talk about linguistics, they kind of switch off. But we know that thematic patterns will be very useful because, as I showed my example, when you do thematic patterns, you can see what is actually missing in the talk that they didn't talk about when they talk with the students. And then when they saw the thematic patterns, they say, "Oh yeah, I didn't say that," And what I found very useful is that most of the time, what is missing are the hypernyms and the murmurnyms. The teacher don't talk about it, but they assume that the students know. And sometimes it can actually get quite confusing, solid, liquid, gas is a type of matter, and then solid itself is made of particles. So there are two different types of semantic relationship. One is a hypernym and one is a murmurnym, and sometimes get very confused. So what I'm trying to do when I try to talk to teachers is I show them, I don't talk about the thematic pattern because that sounds very linguistic, but I show them what was missing in the talk, that they didn't say this and didn't say that, and what is the confusing part for the students, and that's how they begin to buy it. So maybe what we need to do, we need to sort of translate thematic patterns into something that they can handle. So rather than giving them the full package, which can be quite overwhelming, is maybe catch them one at a time, give them a little bit here and a bit there, and then you get more and more into it. So eventually, maybe, oh yeah, I do need to learn linguistics now and understand thematic patterns. I guess that's also how I learned it initially. When I read Lemke's book, I didn't know anything about linguistics, but I thought, oh, this is very useful. And then the more I read, the more you get into it. So perhaps we need to sort of not pushing up too much, but we need to like fishing. We need to find the bait. What is the thing that will catch them? And and I know of some of these common things that will normally attract teachers to see the relevance of thematic patterns. So we need to sort of unpack thematic patterns a bit by bit. So rather than full patterns, look at the crucial semantic relationship that tends to be missing, and then from there we draw them in. So I think that's the way forward for in the domain of teacher education, and not many people are actually doing it, and I hope more people will join us to do this important work. The other one about your next step forward for research, this one I'm not so sure. What is the next step for this research? So I guess what so Lemke has done, the looking at verbal language, the sort of semantic relationships that are involved. Gumperz has sort of looked at images to look at the different semantic relationships, and now people are looking at the multimodal integration part, which I started doing some, but obviously it's not enough. We need to do more. So this the system of when language is combined with images, and obviously we know that there are new semantic relationships that will be made that won't come from either one of the system, and this is applying Lemke's idea of this multiplying principle, right? When you combine verbal and image, the meanings multiply. So there will be new meanings that you won't find in either of the system. So that will mean that for researchers, we need to investigate this integration of that multiple mode. So the most common one is verbal and visual, but they are not the only one. You also should incorporate gestural, and sometimes also mathematics, especially for the higher level science. And some people like myself are beginning to look at material objects as well, because in science there's a lot of hands-on. So when you do investigations, there's a lot of not just the gestures actually, but also the objects. Like if you drop this thing, gravity will put it down. So this is also a semiotic resource. And what is the meaning behind it? What is the system of meaning behind it? So I'm starting to explore in this area. So I think, I don't know, I'm not answering your question, but the way forward now is to build on what our pioneers like Lemke and Gumperz have done with the individual system, but now looking at the multiplication of that system. And that's one thing. The second thing is also, I think there's more need for looking at this system as applied in disciplinary area, which is more specialized. So if you look at Halliday's work, his system is very generic, very general for almost language in general. Gumperz is also looking at image. There's also a more general sense. Lemke is probably the first one that actually applies it more specifically in science as a discipline. So I think we need to combine these two. When we look at the multimodal integration, they tend to also become more disciplinary in nature, because different disciplines require different integration of the modes. So in science is the best example. You will have to combine equation, gestures, hands-on materials, and language in a unique way that you will never find in a history classroom or in a math classroom even. So this multiple integration will converge with the need to go more disciplinary specialized. And I think this is the area. This is the reason why we are here. You are interested in science, and I'm interested in language. So we need to look into that disciplinary specific, and someone else will look at like other disciplines like mathematics or history. But every discipline will have to look at its own semiotic system. So I'm not sure if I can answer that question. Your question.
Yeah, this is really important. Discipline specific, and Halliday talks about transsemiotic, which is kind of like the multimodalities with Halliday in Hong Kong in 2013 saying something about he likes the term transsemiotic, and I like to take his term transsemiotic and turn it into transsemioticizing. That's the origin of the TLTS research group, and it's really important point that Kok-Sing just made, that transsemioticizing, That is, you're saying how to integrate multimodality resources is very discipline specific, the conventions of how you do trans-semiotizing, integrating all these semantic resources, including the objects, the material. Now, turning to the material environment, Michael, you have a question about online teaching. It's a totally different eco-social material environment. So, Michael, over to you to ask your question.
Thank you. Okay, hello, Dr. Tang. Thank you for sharing your new book to us. So I would like to ask something about the extended IRF. So in chapter number 3, you gave a lot of examples about IRE and also IRF in classroom context. However, last year, online learning suddenly became the major learning mode. In our observation and my practice, teachers, actually they generally made a stronger initiation before the lesson, in the lesson, because they do not need to face immediate discipline problems. However, when they came to a student's response, students were reluctant to speak in front of the screen, even in their mother tongue. To cope with this, teachers used a lot of online material, for example, Quizlet, Google Jamboard, to receive written responses to try to give some follow-up of what they thought. So how do you comment or how do you evaluate this new online IRF approach done by our teachers nowadays? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think this is a very interesting question. Just to share you, when my book when my book proposal was confirmed, the title of the book was actually called Discourse Strategies for Science Classrooms. Then COVID happened, and then I realized that classroom is I mean, the idea of classroom still applies in the virtual space, but classroom always had this traditional. It is a room. So that's why I changed my title. So it's now you can see it's not about science classroom. I changed it to science teaching and learning to address this online space. And I think I wrote about 2 paragraphs in the introduction to talk about this online work. But of course, I can't change the rest of the book now. But I did address, acknowledge that online space is quite different. So let's answer the question about especially interaction patterns. I think if you look at thematic patterns, narrative patterns, multimodal patterns, they will still apply. But interaction patterns will be quite drastically changed. So you probably won't find so much IRE pattern, which is so common in face-to-face interactions, and probably not so much IRF, RF interactions. And I think research, we need to really investigate, right? I think not many people have done it yet. What is the predominant interaction patterns? We can still apply the principle that we need to look for patterns, but the patterns will be quite different. And I just want to share my own experience in teaching as well. It was so new to me that, when my teaching is all fully online, I'm also not very used to it because I try to engage them, and then the norm here seems to be the video, and I'm just talking to a blank laptop, and it's very, very uncomfortable. So I don't even know who am I talking to right now. So the whole interaction patterns will be different, and I don't know the answer, but I think there's a need for us to investigate. If you have a chance, if you ever can record, online spaces or teacher or yourself, do investigate what is the interaction pattern using the same ideas that the book has talked about. And one of the thing is that you also mentioned that it's no longer, well, firstly, let me just say that there will still be interaction, definitely, because interaction is not a face-to-face, but it's also looking at your face here. I'm still talking, maybe I'm writing as well. There's an additional chat that you don't normally find in the face-to-face classrooms. And the other thing is also, although you won't have IRF, IRE patterns, but some of the discourse strategies I talk about can still be applied in the online space. So I talk about the follow-up move. So if you ever engage, like now I'm asking questions, you can still use those follow-up moves like probing, extending, reflective thoughts. So for example, rather than me answering your question just now, I could have asked Angel or someone else to answer your question, and that's called reflective thoughts. So you can still apply these techniques in an online space because they are still the same. But the only difference is that the interaction will be very different. So there are things that you can't do, and there are things that you can do. So what are the things you can't do? One of the things you can't do is this idea of proximity, that I can walk towards you. And this is one of the things that teachers do a lot, when they, especially for disciplinary handling, if the student's falling asleep or not paying attention, I walk there, and the student will know that I could pick up. So you lost that opportunity of using the body to communicate. I can't walk to you anymore. And now if you turn on your video, I can't even see you. So you lost those channels, right, of communicating. but you also gain new channels. As I mentioned, that your online chat is a very powerful channel, and I like it as well, because now you can get students to ask questions that they normally will not ask. Because there's in face-to-face, only one person can ask question, and you gotta wait for one another, and you don't have time for that. But in online space, everybody can ask a question if they want to, right? So that's one thing. Second thing is online chat allows you to do private chat. So some students are very shy to ask questions in class, but if they use private chat, their questions is only seen by you and not by the rest. So they will also use that opportunity to do that private chat so that that question can be answered. So we should see online space as giving new opportunities to break away from IRE or even IRF. So IRF is still very I-dominated. It's controlled by the teachers. So even though I say IRF is good in terms of follow-up and dialogic, but it is still dominated by the teacher. But in online space, there might be a possibility where it is no longer a cross shape, but more like a web, where people can interact with one another. And of course, you can use the breakout groups and things like that as well. So you can play around. But I think to come back, we need research really to see what they are doing, and then to evaluate whether these are good or not so good. And that's where we can make recommendations to teachers. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done in this space. I hope to do some research, to get some opportunities to do this research in the online space. But if you have the opportunities, this is a great place to publish those works.
Michael, do you have any other question?
Yeah, actually, I have another question. So after reading the whole book, I discovered that the teachers in the spoken discourses that you have recorded rarely produced any hesitations when they deliver science teacher talks. Do you imply that science teachers should also be excellent English speakers? However, in many places, actually science teachers might not be a proficient English speaker, and it is quite common for a science teacher like me to self-correct their speeches when they talk in lessons. So do these irregularities in spoken discourses hinder students' understanding? If so, do you have any advices for science teachers who are not quite proficient in English, or some new science teacher who are new to use English to teach science?
Okay, yeah, that's a tough questions, and I don't think I have the right answer, but I can give my sort of input suggestions about it. So I think there's yes and no. The English proficiency does matter, and sometimes it doesn't matter so much in communicating the science concept. And why do I say yes and no? I think maybe it's good to look at different levels of how proficiency can affect the content that is being communicated. So if you look at basic grammar, if I say that the ball is falling, and if I say that the ball are falling, which is grammatically wrong, but if you look at the semantic, it doesn't really make a difference, right? So I know English teacher will probably correct me here, but I'm not an English teacher, I'm a science teacher, so I'm looking from science point of view. The grammar is wrong, and it's not good English. Yes, the English teacher will be not happy, but for science teachers, I'm fine. So if a student write, let's say it's an examination, and I have that many times, the grammars are all over the place, plural, singular, past tense, present tense, but I don't care about all these things. As long as I can see the semantic relationship, I saw the content, I see the explanation, I give the marks. So to some extent where the grammar is insignificant to changing the semantic relationship or the genre or the structure of explanation and things like that, I think that's fine. So if the teacher proficiency is, the grammar is not so good, but they can still communicate the semantic relationship, I think that's okay. However, I think there'll be a point in time where your proficiency may affect the semantic relationship that you're communicating. So for example, if you use the wrong word, which will imply a different semantic relationship, then obviously that will kill the subject, that will kill the content, right? So, and I can't think of an example, but I'm sure you understand what I'm talking about. So if you say that I don't know, water is made of particles, or no, water is made of solid, something like that, you confuse that semantic relationship with the words, then obviously the whole content is being confused as well. So to that, I would say yes, if you don't have that level of understanding. Maybe I can also share my example in terms of me when I look at my own students, especially students who are not English is not their first language. So I have a number of international students who are struggling with the English language. So when I read their work, sometimes I can understand what they say. So I bypass all that grammatical mistake. That's fine. I can still understand. But sometimes I just couldn't understand them because I think that their level of English couldn't communicate that semantic relationship that's necessary for me to understand their ideas. So that will answer the question that proficiency does matter at a much higher level.
I think that's a wonderful principle, semantic relations. Now, this word dissolve and melt. In Chinese, it's the same yong. But the semantic relations, totally different. Dissolve and melt, totally different.
That's right.
Semantic. So this principle is very important. Yeah. So over to you, Ivy has been a science teacher for over 10 years in Hong Kong, and now she's a postdoc, Dr. Ivy Zheng in my SFU. Okay, over to you, Ivy.
Hi, Dr. Tang. So I just have questions. Currently, I'm working with Angel, with some teachers and try out your PRO. So we have been trying out to prepare some thematic diagram to illustrate the content knowledge. And what we find out is that I feel that the teachers are really very reluctant to try out the thematic pattern. So even though we try to prepare some handouts and ask the teacher, oh, would you mind, for example, distributing to the students and try to use it to illustrate the idea, they are not using it at all in the lesson. So you just mentioned that, okay, maybe we try to prepare the thematic pattern and then we don't talk about all at a time, just give them bit by bit. So what do you think would be some strategy, or what can we do to make it easier for teachers to accept? Because I think it's true. As science teacher, I hate language, actually. So when I really
similar question, right? Amy just asked a similar question. Yeah.
Even though I need to analyze, I think it's quite difficult for me as well. So I just feel that it's quite difficult to encourage science teacher to do this kind of
linguistic orientation. It's semantics.
Yeah, so that's why I'm just wondering. I mean, would you suggest, or I mean, can you suggest some kind of ways that we can do to, for example, maybe convince the teacher, or it would be easier for teachers to accept that, okay, thematic pattern really helps the students to learn the content knowledge?
Yes, I have the same struggle with you to try to communicate this work with science teachers. So they are quite resistant to language teaching. So thematic patterns is not easy to highlight for science teachers. The PRO is actually much easier. So when I talk about PRO with the teachers, they all buy it because they understand it's important to, or they understand that scientific explanation can be confusing for students, and they like the structure of knowing what is the nature of the explanation. But the PRO and thematic patterns are quite different. So the PRO is looking at a genre level. The thematic patterns is really looking at the discourse semantics and the level, of semantic relationships. So I have more success in getting teachers to use the PRO, and that's where I got all this rich data that I can put in my book. But I have less success in using thematic patterns, convincing teachers to use thematic patterns. So my struggle is as good as yours. And actually, I like Angel's C plus L mapping, and maybe Angel can say more and answer your question rather than me, because I think what Angel did is they took upon an idea that most science teachers know of, which is concept mapping. So all science teachers know concept mapping, and some of them actually used it in their teaching. But what we find is that concept mapping is glossed over a lot of details, right? Because it just say that this is a concept, that's the link, and then a few more concepts here and there. So it's a very simplistic notion of, and it's also a very sort of idealistic notion of what a concept is. So it's an ideal of what it is, but not a reality of what actually happened in the classroom. So I think what Angel is trying to do here is that, combining concept mapping with the idea of thematic patterns. Yeah. So when you show them that the concept mapping, thematic pattern is actually like an extension of concept mapping, and then they will buy the concept is actually quite important.
Actually, the concept and language mapping that my former postdoc, Dr. Emily He and I co-developed. Yeah. Actually, Emily did a lot of work in doing that, and also using this PowerPoint, this audio narrator flashing PowerPoint. Okay, Ivy, you have any other questions? Coming from a science teacher, I mean, and then I have been twisting Ivy's arms, trying to get her interested in the language.
Yeah, I think my question is quite similar to Michael's because, I'm also wondering in an online environment, it's really difficult to get students to participate in a discussion or give feedback. So even though you just mentioned that maybe using a private chat, I mean, some students will be able, but I think some students are still quite passive. I mean, for those really very passive students, they would never use the chat box, or I mean, they would just shut their camera off. So I think this would be the group of students that we need to help the most, especially in an online environment. So how do you think we can adapt our discourse strategies, especially in this online environment, to support this group of students learning? Because if they're very passive, so in the classroom, you can still go and approach them. Okay, do you understand? I mean, do you need any help? Something like that. But in an online environment, I mean, this group of students, I think they would be having less chance to seek for help, or we don't even know that what will be the difficulties that they will be facing. So I'm just wondering how we can, for example, adapt our discourse strategies, or what we can do to support this group of students in learning.
Yeah, that's a good question. From my experience, I think what is happening right now is that in the online environment, because it's so new for many of us, the idea is that we have not, as a teacher community, right, we have not established what is the norm and what is the ground rules, and we have not communicated those ground rules to the students. So that's why we have things like they are switching off their video. Whereas if you think about face-to-face classroom, the culture has been established for hundreds of years. So that culture was developed, the norm was developed, and every student was enculturated to this norm since they went to kindergarten. So they behave, sitting down and answer IRE questions. So we need to understand the history and the culture of it. So my book, The Discourse Strategies, was built on this culture that and I didn't talk about did so much in terms of the disciplinary that you need to do, because there was an assumption that the culture was already established, and most of the teachers, when I worked with them, their classroom was stable culture, because everyone know they're very cooperative, even the students. So I didn't have a lot of this disciplinary issue when I worked with the teacher, and therefore I can build on higher level sort of engagement, like all these discourse strategies. Now when we move to the online environment, we need to re-examine, have we established those culture and those norms? And my sense is that we haven't, because it's so new to all of us, even to me. So I think it will take some years for the culture to emerge within the community, and then slowly the teachers will begin to establish some ground rules. And then after only we have established a ground rule, and after the students have been get used to this ground rules for a while, so maybe for students who are now older, I don't think it will work anymore because they are so new. But maybe like 10 years later, when the new generation grew up in the online space, by the time they come to secondary school, they are also used to the new rule, new culture. And of course, by then we will have a different kind of discourse strategies that is catered for that culture. So I think it will take a lot of time. I don't think it's something that within a year we can establish very effective discourse. I think that would be sort of too idealistic to imagine that we can do that. But I think we need time for that culture to emerge and stabilize first before we can actually talk about all this more higher level kind of discourse strategies. And I just talked about another thing to go back to the idea about thematic patterns, how to sort of communicate with the teachers. One of the things that I try to do is to use the language that science teachers use, and that will again catch them. So the idea of concept. Science teachers talk about concept all the time. Oh, I need to teach this concept. Oh, the students don't understand that concept. So they keep on using this word concept. Then I ask them, what is a concept? And they think, yeah, what is a concept? They using it so often that they don't know actually what it means, right? So then they always say, oh, it's an idea. Then I question them some more. So every idea is a concept. They know. So they begin to question. So through question, they begin to say, oh yeah, concept is actually what we say, and then eventually I try to lead them to see that actually concept is a pattern. It's a thematic pattern, actually, that's the answer. But slowly getting to see that a concept is really a pattern. And what I try to do is that, at least this in physics, right, a lot of concept to really understand the concept, you really need to see a lot of patterns. And when I say patterns, right, Lemke call it the repetition with variation pattern. There's a certain pattern in terms of what is going up, what is coming down. When it's going up, it gets hotter. When it's going down, it gets colder. So you can see a lot of this equivalent concept in a similar manner. So I try to use this example to show them, all this concept we talk about is really about this pattern. So if the students understand the pattern, then they'll understand the concept. So I'm trying to use that to catch them to understand thematic pattern. And this is also where I try to simplify thematic patterns a bit, because if you give them the full thematic pattern, they get lost in what is the gist of that pattern. So I try to scale it down and remove all the more minor details, but to show them essentially the main concept. So the main pattern, like going up, coming down. Going up means going hot, becoming cold. So when you saw that pattern in a very simplified diagram, they began to bite it. One of my examples was and I think Chi Hua will probably know that, those who teach physics, or Michael, about kinetic energy and potential energy. If you study that whole topic, right, it's all about going up, coming down, and there's always a conservation. What goes up must be the same as what goes down. So there's all this pattern around. And when I was a student, when I learned physics, actually that's how I learned. I saw that pattern, even though the teacher didn't tell me that, but I managed to solve it, and maybe that explains why I did physics. But a lot of my classmates didn't see the patterns, so for them they got so lost about physics is so hard. But then I say, this is very easy, I just see the pattern only. But of course, at that time, I don't have the language to talk about the pattern, but I saw the pattern implicitly. So I think when we talk to teachers, if you can show them those patterns in a simplified manner, and they can see the pattern, then they can buy this idea of thematic pattern. Yeah, so just sharing that example with you.
Yeah, exactly, precisely. J. Lemke is trying to get science teachers away from that mentalism. The concept, they think I'm teaching concept. This kind of mentalism has dominated science education for many, many years. And Lemke was the first one to critique this mentalism in science education. And you talk about pattern is so important in AI learning. And if you change the thinking from concept to pattern, then it is very material, very embodied. It's not just gesture. But also, you talk about the hands-on experiments is trying to get this pattern, repetition of this pattern. It's not a concept that resides in our mental, cognitive realm, some mysterious mind. Okay. Over to you, April. You have a question too. April is teaching in Hong Kong, my former PhD student, very bright student.
Okay.
Hi, Dr. Tan. So thank you very much for inspiring us about the research and practice in science education. So may I know more about multimodality in science in your 2021 new book? So in your book, you have distinguish between the macro event analysis and also the micro discursive analysis in the patterns of multimodal translation and multimodal integration in chapter 7 and 8. So could you please elaborate a little bit on what it means by macro timescale event analysis and the micro level timescale in your book?
Yeah, so this idea of timescale also came from Lemke when he talked about when you look at classroom event, it's good to look at different levels of time scale. So when I talk about macro time scale event, I'm looking at the whole lesson as a whole. So a lesson is normally about 60 minutes or less than that. So within this time scale, you look at the major chunks of activities. And in this major chunks of activity, you find that normally there's a dominant mode of representation. Of course, all meanings are always multimodal, but there's often a dominant mode. So for example, right now, our dominant mode is face-to-face. I'm not showing my slides, but earlier when I showed you my slide was the dominant representation because all of you are looking at the slide and I'm talking with the slide as well. So at different points of the lesson, at chunks of 5-10 minutes or so, there's always sort of a dominant representation that is guiding or structuring their participation. Most common will be a PowerPoint, a video, worksheets even. So when the students are writing worksheet, that worksheet becomes the dominant mode representation that facilitates that interactions. So when I talk about macro analysis, I'm looking at what is the dominant representation in the time scale of about an average 5-10 minutes or maybe even 3 minutes or so. And then I look at the translation of this mode from one mode to another mode. And then you can actually see some pattern already just by looking at the macro time scale in science. Normally, of course, this is normally, there are exceptions. In science, when the teachers want to engage with the students, of course, the first mode is verbal first, because you greet one another, you talk about, today's lesson, you talk about yesterday's lesson. So verbal first, about maybe 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Then when the teachers start to introduce a new concept, sometimes they will bring in some hands-on toys to show them, or show them some video or some exciting phenomena. And that is also a pedagogically good idea to start a lesson, to engage them with the concept, the idea, or the phenomenon first. So the mode here is usually more concrete, more hands-on kind of mode. So actually that's a mode. Then later on, you find that the teacher will need to translate this mode to another mode now. And usually from this translation, it becomes something more abstract. So you cannot just talk about hands-on all the time. That's not, yes, you are engaging science, but you won't be learning any concept, right? So the next phase normally is depending, sometimes they will use drawing. So for example, I have many examples where the teacher showed the water, and then the water pressure coming up. The next thing is he draw the diagram, and then he showed, the shooting of the water. So this is a very common translation happening. You go for some material to a visual, and there's some very good reasons for that, because visual, then now you can annotate, you can talk about it, and you can do other things that you can't do materially. So that's another mode. Then eventually you will find that the verbal mode will come in more and more, especially the writing. Then it became to write. Either the teacher write a lot, or the teacher will make the students write a lot in the worksheets and so on. So and writing becomes dominant because there is this need to go to the abstract. And science is very abstract. You need to use writing in order to understand the abstraction. So that's the macro analysis I look at, and I'm looking at the translation of representation. So I call it the multimodal translation, which is how does one mode translate to another mode and another mode in a broad time scale. But that's not enough. So we need to now go to the second level, which is looking at the micro level, and this is really looking at the time scale of less than 1 minute or so, or a few seconds. And from a discourse analysis point of view, so maybe I talk about also from discourse analysis point of view. When I look at the video, I look at the macro first. Obviously, you need to understand what is the macro event. Then I quote what is the representation they use. I have a sort of a time chart. I'm sure you have that as well. That's the first step I need to do, because I need to have an overview of what's going on. But then after I've done that, I need to zoom in, and but my macro analysis will help me to identify some of the key moments, which is extremely crucial in terms of understanding the science. And you can easily say that when there's some aha moment, or when there's a very rich discussion going on, or when the student finally realize something. So these are the key moments, and that's where you need to zoom in and understand what is happening within this key moment. And it's normally like only a few minutes long. And that key moment will involve a lot of exchange between the verbal, but usually it's not just the verbal as well. Usually they'll be looking at some diagram, or maybe drawing some diagram, maybe some graph or equation from my few examples. And that's where I look at the micro event, which is looking at the multimodal integration. So this is looking at the combination of your speech, your gestures, your drawing, your equation, and so on. And this is where you find that the science is being constructed. And through my experience in all my discourse analysis, it's always mostly multimodal. It's never really just one mode. So that's where you need to harness the different modes from an analysis point of view to know what they are doing. But I'm sure from a learning and teaching point of view, that's also what is required for them to actually learn the concept by integrating all these different modes. So you have two different levels, the macro event, which is looking at translation, and then the micro event, which is the multimodal integration. So in my book, I have two chapters, one chapter for the broader one and one chapter for the more micro one. And this is how they are sort of connected. And I will say that for the micro one, it's the same idea as what I talked about as thematic patterns. So I also use thematic patterns to look at the semantic relationships. But as I mentioned earlier, it's not just the words that they use, but the gesture actually has a semantic relationship as well. When I do this, for example, there's a semantic relationship going on. When I show this, I look at those modes as well to piece out the semantic relationships, and then I try to construct a thematic pattern. If you see my book, you can see the examples. So sometimes they don't use the words, but the diagrams substitute the words. So therefore, you need to put the diagram into your thematic patterns. So that's how I try to understand what is going on. I hope that answered the questions.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Tan. Thank you very much. I will definitely introduce your book to my students in the professional development programs because I have been working with in-service teachers. Some of them are using English to teach content subjects, science and integrated science. So I think your book will be very useful for them. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's written so in such a teacher-friendly manner. It's really, really a great contribution.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, actually, they were my main target audience when I wrote the book.
Phoebe, you have a question too.
Yeah, thank you. So, Dr. Tan, I would like to draw our attention to the development of artificial intelligence now, because you mentioned that because of the pandemic situation, now students used to online teaching and learning modes, and many of them will try to hide themselves behind the camera mode when they are having the e-lessons. And after class, maybe they will watch back the videos of their science lesson and then maybe search from the internet to have some self-directed support. And also you mentioned about breakout room functions as well on the Zoom or Microsoft Teams application. And then students enjoy peer dialogues and also peer mental support. So my question will be how this kind of applications or tools about thinking process or peer dialogic scaffold or more heteroglossic resources would be useful to your research or your discourse strategies mentioned in your new book. Yeah, that's my main interest. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, yeah. So when we talk about integration of technology, whenever I look at technology, I don't just look at the hardware, what is the tech behind it, but I always try to see technology from a multimodal point of view. So what is the modes that this technology allows you to have that you didn't have earlier? So in this online space now, it will be there's more multimodal and there's less multimodal in some sense. Less multimodal in the sense that there isn't this face hands-on interaction, so you lost that. But I think it becomes a lot more visual when you look at online space. So throughout this whole thing, I'm only looking at my screen, and that's my only interaction. But in the screen, there's so much things to see, right? So visual, I think, will become much more prominent, and I think that's what Gumperz has highlighted as well. In this new digital age, the visual will become more prominent than the verbal eventually. So I think when I try to look at technology, I always try to analyze what is the mode behind that technology and how does that facilitate the interactions in the people. So I want to analyze an online environment. It's not just the technology per se, but I look at the chat. So chat is actually more like a visual, not visual, a written mode, right? But it's not just written as well. I think it's a combination of written and verbal. So that could actually be a new system. So when people define mode in social semiotics, right, you find that, when they define mode, traditionally we think about mode as, verbal, visual, gestural, and so on. But now we can begin to see new mode that came about from technology. So like, for example, emoji is actually a new mode, not just a visual mode, because it combines, other things as well. Or the other good example is animation. I don't know whether you're familiar with Andrew Ben's work about animation. He talked about it as a new mode called, this is a very complicated word, kinesthetic. It's a word that combines kinetic or with some sort of semiotics. It's a new term. But the idea is that animation is actually a new mode. It's not just a visual mode, but it combines the visual with a bit of movement as well. So the movement is where the gestural is dominant, but you somehow capture that movement within an animation. So I think going forward, it will be a very exciting time. A lot of new things to look at. So when you analyze chat, when you analyze emojis, you analyze animation, these are new modes on their own. So if you apply the question, I think Amy asked it, or someone asked the question about the semiotic system. In SFL, there's all this concentric circle about what is the concept of realization, the genre, register, the discourse semantics, and then the last one is lexical grammar, and then the last one is about the words, the graphology and the phenomenology, phonology, the sound. Yeah. Right. So that's a traditional view, the sound and the writing, but that is like 30 years ago. Now what do we have? We have so much, all these new resources. There's emoji. So emoji now is a new science. So what is the system of emoji at the lexical grammatical level, and then what is the system of register using emoji. It's so complicated, and then it's not just emoji, but emoji combining with chat, combining with online space, combining with so many things. So there will be a lot of new areas to look at. It's very exciting, but they're so overwhelming as well. But I think that maybe that's where you can also do more research work in, and I think there's so much opportunities to work in all these areas.
Phoebe, could I jump in to ask a question from Jason first? Jason cannot come in. He's one of our hosts. This question is about language teachers' role in science teaching and learning. What role do you think a language teacher like Jason, he's now teaching in the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology in the language center, So he's a language teacher, but serving a lot of science students. So what role can a language teacher like Jason can play in implementing your discourse strategy approach in science, language, CLIL, ESP, EAP classroom? What challenges do you anticipate? Any suggestions in overcoming challenges like resistance from science and language teachers? I have also put the question on the chat box.
Yeah, I can see on the chat. But yes, that's a great question. So obviously there's a very big role for language teachers like Jason and all of you to work with science teachers. And I mentioned some of this earlier. So you need language teachers to highlight the language awareness that most science teachers don't see or not even convinced that it's important. So you need to convince them. You need to help them to see the relevance part. So language awareness is obviously one thing. Earlier, I was talking about the need for overt instruction or explicit instruction. So most science teachers are not very explicit. They only focus on the content. But if you can convince them, like what we talked about, that the content is directly connected to the language awareness through semantic, so through thematic patterns and through genre and things like that, that will help them to convince them that it is actually, you're not doing the different things, you're doing exactly the same thing, to teach concept through that language process. So, and that is, we need people from the language education people to show just what is required, because they, unfortunately, science education training don't really provide that. I try my part to do it, but it's just so little. Most of them focus on concept. So we need to highlight this awareness, and I think there's more people doing that, but it's not enough. So we definitely need more people, and what I want to say is that there's a lot more and more of this science and language synergy, as that's why Angel and I connected, and also with Christina from Sweden. So there's more and more of these connections coming together. And actually, that they're not new. Actually, there were 20 years ago, there were already some connections, but mostly in America. But now it's actually more international now. And I'm happy to say that, Angel and myself and a few of us were members of this SIG group that we actually try to bring people from language and science education together, and we had this dynamic group that is going on. Let me talk about some of the challenges I think Jason talked about. Yes, there will be some challenges whenever you do all this interdisciplinary work. There will be challenges on both sides, and I should share my experience about it, because sometimes you feel that you're not being accepted by each community. So as a science educator myself, when I try to cross into language education, there's always some resistance, like, what can you do that I can't do? That kind of suspicions around, and it took me a while to really connect with language people, and I have many failures I can talk about, but I won't say that. But there are also success, like Angel and I, we connected and we have so much synergy, and Christina and so on. So yes, there will be challenges in crossing over to the other community. There will also be challenges when you go back to your own community, because when now as a science education, I go back to science education and tell them, hey, look at language, they will all ignore me. So that's, then you feel that, you're neither on each side. So you will face this barrier, I would say. But don't be discouraged, because there are people like us, but if you do find friends within that space, you will form very close connections, because then you will really appreciate the need to connect these two communities together. What suggestions can I give to overcome these challenges? I would say that from my experience, one of the recommendation I would say is to do code switching, and I'm sure all of you are expert in this area, translanguaging. You need to translate your language when you work across different communities. You need to code switch. So when I work with science teachers, when I talk to science education, I use a different set of language that when I talk to people like you in language education. So I can talk about SFL with you with no problem. But I wouldn't even mention SFL with science education people. I would actually translate. I don't use words like, register, tenure, note. This already put people off. But I try to translate in a way that they can understand. So for you as a language education coming to science education, I think what you need to do is firstly maybe to be familiar with what is the language that we use in science education and see whether you can translate your ideas to using that language. And I'll give one example. The best example I can give is the translation from genre to scientific practices. So I mentioned that scientific practices is now one of the biggest hot topic in science education. If you are familiar with NGSS, the next generation science standards, it is almost like a Bible to many science education in America especially. They always talk about NGSS all the time. And in NGSS, they talk about the scientific practices. So there are 8 practices. Argument, explanation is one of them. Communication is also another one. So then I talk about, scientific practices. If you look from a discourse perspective, they are very similar to the idea of genre, and genre being a pattern of register, being a pattern of lexical grammar. That's where you can come in to sell that idea. But you may initially not use the word genre in the first place, because for science education, genre has a very negative edgy connotation. But you may want to use the language of scientific practice or argumentation or explanation, but bringing across your idea of a genre. So when I publish in 2 different committees, I'm actually very conscious in my language. When I publish in science education, I use science education language. When I publish in, say, linguistic education, I use language education terminologies. So you need to do a bit of code switching. You guys are the expert in code switching, so you know what I'm talking about here. So yeah, that's my challenge and suggestions to you.
It's like when in Rome, talk like the Romans.
Yes.
Yes. This ties into Jason's another question about genre. Coming from Australia, you would know genre-based approaches is huge in Australia. So like Jim Martin, Pauline Jones, Deborah Anchor. So this question from Jason is how do you position your work in relation to these genre pedagogy scholars in Australia?
Yes, that's one of the challenges that I have as well, trying to work within this space. So my work, especially on the PRO framework, was informed by genre theory, definitely. But it's actually quite a different approach from the genre, or maybe I call it genre pedagogy. So we confuse the term. So genre pedagogy is a whole package on its own that has quite specific way of teaching. This cycle called deconstructing, constructing. Yeah, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. So I don't really use that genre approach. I think part of the reason is like what Ivy said, and there's a lot of resistance from science teachers. So I sort of adapted it and used Pro, which is a more simplified and talking with their language of explanation. And I use language like premise, which they like because science has a lot, or I call it principle. So I sort of readapt some ideas from genre theory, not genre pedagogy, genre theory in terms of the structure of a genre, in terms of conjunctions and sequences and so on. And I adapted it into the Pro framework. So when I do the Pro framework, it's not just the PRO, but I also develop some sort of scaffolding, like worksheets and things like that, to help the teachers and students to construct explanation. So a lot of it were actually looking at sequencing and looking at conjunctions. So that's where I introduced the word conjunction to the teachers, not telling them, but using the importance of conjunction within an explanation. So that's why they understand why conjunction is important. But if I didn't use explanation as a context, I would never be able to convince them that conjunctions are important. So that's how I try to marry the 2 different parts. So genre pedagogy, I think is perhaps very useful for clear context, because that's the students don't have the official language to even communicate. So in my work, as you know, I don't really work directly with clear classroom. But most of my classrooms that I work with are first language learners in the States, even in Singapore, where English is actually their first language, and in Australia now. So I haven't found the need to use genre pedagogy to work with my own research project, but I can definitely see its appeal and its relevance for CLIL students.
Yeah. So Jason also has this question about Peter Wright and Jim Martin's appraisal system. Jason must have been a very great fan of the Sydney School. So coming from Australia again, how do you transition your work to the appraisal system because you talk about the metadiscourse.
Yeah, so I mentioned somewhere in my slides that there's a lot of overlaps and similarities between evaluative metadiscourses, actually quite similar with Martin appraisal. So when I first learned about metadiscourse, I thought, yeah, actually it's very similar with Martin's appraisal. And I think that's maybe also helped me to understand metadiscourse because I already know Martin's appraisal system. So actually, when thinking about it, my work, I can actually restructure it not using metadiscourse, but talk about it in terms of appraisal, and also for textual minor function, talk about it in terms of Halliday's and Hassan's cohesions. So there's actually a different way I can organize my book. But I felt that metadiscourse really speaks to me more because it's sort of directly connected with the idea of this narration or scientific story. And in some science education, people have been talking about narration. So I saw that connection here. And I also feel that the use of metadiscourse is quite useful to help me to distinguish between what is a metadiscourse and what is the content, which is the thematic patterns actually. So it helped me to sort of separate them. And that's why I can organize thematic pattern as chapter 4, which look at the content, and then focus on one chapter or the non-content related commentary, which teachers actually talk a lot, and that's metadiscourse. So when I use metadiscourse and I begin to talk about it as a commentary, then they begin to say, yeah, actually teachers use commentary all the time. They give comments about their own talk. So I think that's a way for me to come in and say, you need to look at your own talk, which is called metadiscourse, because you do that all the time. You know, when you talk, you don't just talk the content, but you talk about what you talk about. That's your meta talk. So that's where I find it more useful rather than using Martin's appraisal system. And also, I think in science education, not many people have actually applied Martin's appraisal system. I think he used it a lot in history and social studies research. So that's really a gap there. In fact, actually, metadiscourse, the more I research about it, I realized that there's a lot of people actually are very interested and they're doing a lot of work. In fact, Ken Highland, I think you probably know him from University of Hong Kong, is one of big name in metadiscourse, and I was very informed by his work in that area. So yeah, I began to do more research into metadiscourse and make the connection to that research space as well. Yeah.
Yep. Amy, I would like to give you the final chance to ask questions because Amy always asks a very insightful questions.
Challenging questions, yeah.
Challenging questions.
No, it's actually, I really appreciate this opportunity because it's really quite precious to have you as we are all doing translanguaging, but it's what you mentioned, like kind of we are working also on semantic pattern, translating semantic pattern underlying different wordings in different disciplines, right? So you are seeing this as like say this will be scientific practices that we are more used to call this genre. But then that's why we need to talk, and it's also we really need to learn a lot of language also from you, that kind of interlanguage. Right? So my question is actually follow up in ways forward. Then it's also in terms of like because you just mentioned in terms of in response to April's question about multimodal integration, those patterning, and I actually realized that you actually are you developing some kind of like on your chapter 7 or 8 the language like verbal language as like the semantic relations like physical material or logical temporal. That's kind of also developing the original semantic relations by Lemke, right? But also kind of acting on a disciplinary specific or kind of tactic to it. So I'm wondering, are you developing a kind of a repertoire of this kind of language that will be more kind of accessible to language to science teachers, or it's just now at the stage of research, but not yet getting back to teachers and see how they would react to this kind of language? Would that be more accessible to them? Like, because in those language will kind of incorporate both, it's multi-semiotic or right? In that case, like, and then you also use like visual, like association, analytic, connective, temporal, right? So would that be some kind of ways forward too? And then that's one, and then another related would be like in terms of methodology, research methodology, because you also mentioned that it's when you go into the details or even macro or the micro analysis, then it will be so complex and quite consuming. And I was wondering, how do you do this kind of analysis? And then also with the mind of benefiting teachers, not making it too complex for them to understand. Yeah, so 2 questions.
Yeah, okay. Yes, it's a constant struggle that I do have when I wrote the book, and also even now, that you're wearing 2 hats here, right? As a researcher and also as a teacher educator, thinking for the teachers. And I try my best to balance between these 2 tensions, and sometimes they do conflict a bit, especially in terms of the use of the language in the book. So when I wrote the book, of course, I'm very mindful that I'm writing for science teachers, but I can't escape from the fact that I have to show some analysis in order to show the relevance of the transcript, for example. And I have to also introduce the framework like thematic patterns or metadiscourse. So inevitably, I did use a lot of terminologies that I'm quite aware of. You don't have to tell me that. I know that when science teachers read it, they might feel overwhelming because there's so many new terms to learn. So I'm quite aware about that. So this is actually a constant sort of balancing act that we have to do, that we need to bring in the research, and that will definitely introduce some new but without those terms, how else can you communicate those frameworks? So that there is this tension that you have to introduce something, not too much preferably, but you can't avoid it. So yes, you are right that in the book there are some terms that I can't avoid it. What I try to do is I try to translate that as easy as I can from a science teacher's point of view, whether they can understand it. So some of the terms from SFL can be quite technical, and I sort of replace them with some simpler terms. So that's the translation work that I need to do for the teachers. And I guess the book will probably need some help as well. So if you ever teach in-service teachers, you can use the book as a guide, but I think they will still need you as the expert to guide them through, because if I'm a science teacher reading my own book, I probably find it so complicated. But that's where you probably need guidance. And I think my book is probably also suitable for teacher educators, and that's actually the other audience as well. So and I do know that many teacher educators want to actually teach their student teachers about language, but they don't have resources that will help them. Well, we have resources like SFL, but I think for them it's actually too complicated. So I think I'm also seeing myself as a translator for the teacher educator to SFL, or translator between science and language education. So that's how I see myself in this whole research bit, as a translator for different people, for teachers, for science educators, for science teacher educators, and so on. So there's always this translation work that we are always doing to make our work accessible, but also to build synergy across different groups of people.
Yeah. It's a really, we are twinners between. And then Alan Luke, also from Australia, Queensland University, emeritus professor. Alan Luke coined the term twinner. We are twinners. We are twinners between. And these days we have to become twinners. And I want to thank Kok-Sing once again. It's almost 2 hours. And I also want to thank all our hosts, student hosts and postdoc hosts. You have prepared wonderful questions and really draw out all the great interesting points from Kok-Sing's book. Can Kok-Sing show your book again? We have to circulate it among science teachers and language teachers interested in content and language integrated learning, content-based education. I think this is a great contribution to our field, because coming from your background, you have transdisciplinary background, being a translator, a twinner, and a transdisciplinary scholar. I'd like to thank you once more, Kok-Sing, and from the bottom of my heart, and thank my co-host. And I want to remind our audience, April 16th, we have the next seminar, which is about translanguaging in TESOL education, teaching English to speakers of other languages. And then in May, we will have Rodney Jones about the broken internet, and also about social media, critical social media literacies, and it has a lot to do with scientific literacies, right? Yeah. So stay tuned in to our channel and press the button reminder, the bell, and then you will get notices about our upcoming seminars. So we will try to have one seminar per month. So thank you so much for your precious time. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for everybody who's tuned in to our channel. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. This was very good discussions with all of you. Nice to see you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.